Shaykh Ebrahim, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to the podcast.
Wa alaikum salam, sir.
It's a pleasure and honor to have you back. Our viewers will remember we had you here not too long ago, and we talked about your background in Tasawwuf, Sufism, and spirituality. Today, I wanted to talk to you about a slightly different aspect of your life, which is to do with business consultancy. As I understand, you have developed a business model called Care and Growth Model. Would you please mind just explaining a little bit about it? What inspired you to develop that and how you got to where you are today with it?
I was employed by an organization called the South African Chamber of Mines Research Organization in the early 80s in South Africa. And basically in a role to research conflict. I mean, I worked for a laboratory that was called the Human Resources Laboratory, and one of the key themes that they explored was the issue of conflict on mines. And I mean, as you can imagine, this was the 80s in South Africa. We were basically in a civil war, so a lot of the conflict that was happening in the country was really happening on mines. So I had this wonderful opportunity as a young man from 1982 onwards to kind of have a look at extremely dysfunctional organizations and big organizations. I mean, there's South African deep level mines. You know, a small mine would employ 6,000 people. You had mines that employed in the 40s, 40,000. 44,000 people was then the biggest mine, Val Reefs. So these were massive organizations. A lot of my understanding found its roots there. And it was right from the start, I recognized that, you know, the key variable that you need to wrap your head around if you're trying to understand the difference between sick and healthy organizations is the issue of intent, and particularly the issue of the intent of the leadership, but also the issue of the intent of the average person in the organization. That is sort of the pixie dust. That's what accounts for the difference between successful and unsuccessful organizations.
That's really interesting, because when I first heard about your business model, I was thinking, in my head, yeah, this sounds great in like an ideal kind of a scenario, but in real life, where, especially in different cultural setups and stuff, it may not be so easy to actually implement. But your actual start was right at the deep end, because I can imagine working in South Africa in mining anywhere is difficult. And in South Africa, I can imagine. I'd love to know a bit more about that. But can you please explain the model as it is?
Sure.
If you could describe it.
I mean, it's interesting that you said the deep end. You know, the deepest mines in the world are in South Africa. I was working on a mine that had their deepest workings were 4,500 meters down. That's 4.5 kilometers straight underground. I mean, it's like staggeringly deep. And I mean, just the technical problems associated with working at that depth. You know, you're dealing with unimaginable pressures and
I mean, did you ever have any in your time? Did they have any accidents or any?
All the time. I mean, to this day, the South African deep level mining is dangerous. I mean, people die all the time.
Wow.
Yeah, particularly then, because you also you had the added sort of variable of discipline that you had a lot of ill discipline at work, and that's one of the things that keeps people alive underground is that they do what, unfortunately, they act to rule. And so as soon as you start getting rebellious and undisciplined, you have undisciplined workplaces, that kills people.
Also, the background between the leadership and the workers, their kind of economic status, their education, just different cultures and stuff.
I mean,
it must be
the sort of the short history of the South African gold mining industry was that it was first started in the late 19th century, sort of in the 1880s, late 1880s. and they struggled to get a labor force. And there was a move right at the beginning in the early days of the industry to get Chinese indentured laborers. That didn't work. I mean, that was just the brutality of the mines. Just people just didn't work for that workforce. So people stopped working on mines. So the industry then, basically in collusion with the government, worked to dispossess black people and create a need for cash with black people, so that more and more people sort of kind of had to go into the mines to work. So you had it was basically built on migrant labor of mainly dispossessed rural Africans, South African Africans, at least Southern African Africans. In the early days, the conditions were appalling. I mean, you had people who lived in hostels that you had 40 men to a tiny room. Very rough conditions. So the conditions underground were equally appalling. I mean, people died of heat exhaustion, and because of the depths that you were working at. And then also there was the just the straightforward brutality in the management styles. I mean, it was in the up until the early 60s. There was no telling. If you're a black employee on a mine, you could be assaulted at work and nothing would happen to your boss. And so it was just the worst of apartheid. In fact, from one point of view, apartheid you can say was one of the sort of the institutional kind of building blocks that enabled gold mining to continue as it did for many years. And when I worked in the mining industry, it was kind of at the time of great disruption in the industry, and all of these things were being tested. I mean, the trade unions were legalized. The first thing that was kind of under attack was job reservation. In the 80s, when I was working, still a black person could not blast. They could not get a blasting certificate. They could not work under. They could not. They couldn't get a designated supervisory position underground. So that all changed in the late 80s, early 90s. So I was in that period of transition that I did that research. But what was amazing?
What was your job in that environment that kind of got you to developing the growth caring growth model? Were you hired as like a consultant or HR, or what was your?
No. So this research organization was very big. I mean, they employed 600 researchers, mainly in technical kind of labs. The Chamber of Mines Research Organization. In fact, I think they were the biggest privately funded research organization in the world at the time. But most of the work that was done was kind of in technical disciplines like rock mechanics and ventilation science and explosive science and things like that. But there was one of the labs was called the Human Resources Laboratory, and it was very charming. Every one of these labs had like what they called what they called it again? They called it a charter, which is like a one-line description of the scope of work of the lab. And the charter of the Human Resources Laboratory was to investigate the human problem on mines, because human beings were problematic on mines. They were trying to burn down the industry. And so when I joined the lab, there was a range of projects going on. Some sort of things looking at psychometrics and sort of selection and testing and that sort of thing. But there was this project that focused on conflict. And so I was very fortunate. I got sent into this project, and at the time, the modus operandi of the project was historical. And what I mean by that is, if there was a fight on a mine, we would send a crew of researchers to the mine, and we'd do a body count. I mean, literally, how many people were killed here. We would work out, who mobilized against who, what were the issues. We would take all of that information and we'd do two things with the information. We would write up a report on the fight concerned, and we would also add the information to a growing body of information, which is called the conflict diary, and as it suggests, literally tracked conflicts over time. But by about 1994, there was pushback coming from the industry with regard to this work that we were doing, because basically what senior management in the industry was saying that, this isn't useful. Don't tell me how many people got killed on the mine, because I know that. I told you that. To help us stop this. I mean, I was then asked to develop an instrument that would measure the climate of employee opinion on a mine. And the idea would be that this thing would kind of operate like a dipstick, so that if you thought that something was going wrong in an operation, then they would call us in, and would stick in the dipstick and we'd take a reading and either say you've got a problem or you don't have a problem. And that work started in 1984, and we actually continued doing that work right until the time I left the Chamber of Mines, right at the end of the 80s. So when we finished, through this project, we'd spoken to just short of 10,000 employees. So it was quite a solid piece of work, By 1988, there was sort of there was a further iteration of the kind of the pushback from the industry, because now people are saying, well, you've done all of these diagnostics, you've spoken to these thousands of people on all of these shafts across the industry. Surely you've come to understand something about making, what's the difference between a sick and a healthy climate? How do you make things right? So I was then asked to develop a remedial model. So it started off with the diagnostic work, and then I developed, and the care and growth model really was based on that remedial work. That was done in 1988 and 1989. And then I left the Chamber of Mines because I thought, we understood enough about the difference between sick and healthy organizations to be able to work with the stuff in any kind of industry, not just on mines, and not just in very conflict-ridden ones, So, your initial question was, what is this care and growth model about? How does it work? So the key thing that became apparent to me is that if the difference between a sick and a healthy organization actually has to do with the intent of the average individual in the organization. We have a metaphor to help to explain this, and we call it the three bakers analogy. Because what the three bakers analogy helps you to do is to understand at least how technocratic kind of like, or at least capitalist enterprises become profitable. And what it says is, let's say we've got three bakers who collaborate to bake a cake. And let's say that at the end of the month, the cake is sold, and each baker takes an equivalent slice of the cake to take home to feed their family. If there's a slice left, then you would refer to that slice as a profit if you're a capitalist, or as a surplus if you're a good socialist. But the point is that you would generally measure the success of the enterprise on the basis of that fourth slice. The bigger that fourth slice is, the bigger the surplus is with regard to the rest of the cake, the more successful you'll deem the enterprise to be. Now, if this is true, you need to ask yourself, how did that happen? Why does that happen? And that surely is because most of the, basically the entire, the cake that was baked was bigger than what each individual took home. In other words, collectively, these people gave more than what they took. So that really accounts for the difference between successful and unsuccessful organizations. When you populated any group of people who are trying to get as much as they can for giving as little as possible, then the organization is sick and will eventually implode. When you populate a group of people, the degree to which people are in an organization or in a group to make a discretionary contribution to the organization, willing to go the extra mile for the organization, that's the degree to which the organization will succeed. And what became apparent to me is that actually the thing that most profoundly accounts for this intent of the average individual to be there, to go the extra mile, is really how they led. People go the extra mile for people. And what became apparent is that most managers on mines got this thing like frightfully wrong. Even if they'd gone to sort of more modern business schools and they were sort of taught modern management, if you ask them, so why are you the boss? What does being in charge mean? What is leadership about? You could get all sorts of words from people, and a lot of them would sound very nice. It'd be about coaching people and listening to people and mentoring people and being approachable. There are all sorts of kind things, and then there'll be sort of also some businessy kind of themes like it's also about providing a vision and setting a goal and giving a direction. And so however these people looked at their role, there'd be these two components to it. There'd be a people component and there'll be an outcome component, sort of a result or a goal component. And those two things were causally linked. So what they'd say is something like leadership is about achieving a result or an outcome through people. Now, that sounds kind of sense. But the problem with that statement is that the intent of that statement is a taking intent. I mean, if I'm you, if my job is to get a result through you, you are the means that I'm going to use to achieve the result. And we're actually shameless about it. I would call you my human resource, in order to get the thing that I want from you. I mean, so my relationship with you is a taking relationship, and people don't give to takers, So most leaders get this thing frightfully wrong. I mean, if they think their job is to achieve a result through people, they actually cultivate people here to get rather than people are here to give. And then on the mines, you on occasion you came across somebody who really didn't think like that about their job. They had almost like an inverted view. They sort of their understanding was like a coach in a soccer game. That my job is not to achieve. Coach doesn't achieve a result. That's what the player does. Now, that doesn't suggest that the coach doesn't have a job. I mean, the coach's job is to coach the player. But in order to coach the player, that doesn't mean to say he now has no interest in the game that's being played and has no interest in the result, because he can't coach the game if you don't know what's happening in the scoreboard and he doesn't know what's happening on the field. But those two things aren't his job. Those two things are his means to do his job, which is to coach the player. In other words, the coach's job is to cultivate the player, and he uses the game that's being played and the result as his means to do that. So actually he's got an inverted view. He says my job is to achieve people through results, rather than to say and you can get people who run very rough enterprises who think like that. I found men on mines who thought like that. That they actually had and that didn't mean to say that they were always nice, because very often a good coach isn't nice.
Yeah.
And if a good coach is really passionate about making the best in you possible, they very often might not be very friendly. But their aim is you. You are the product of the and that's where the kind of the care and growth idea kind of became apparent. Because what became apparent to me is that this idea of political correctness, that this is all about trying to democratize the workplace, that completely misses the point. I mean, I found really like harsh, brutal men whose people would go absolutely to the gates of hell and back for them. And why? Because the guy was there for his people, not the other way around. So if you ask people to describe the boss that they would work for because they wanted to, and I mean, this work started on mines, but I've continued with it in the sort of 3 decades since. And it really doesn't matter who you ask this question of. You can ask this question of anybody in the world. If I were to say to a person, describe your ideal boss, the sort of boss that you would work for because you really wanted to, the first thing the person will say is some very kind and nice things. A boss who's approachable, a boss who's helpful, a boss who listens to me, a boss who's respectful, a boss who's kind and compassionate and sympathetic and all sorts of nice stuff. But then people also say a different category of things. they'd say something, I also want to work for a boss who's fair. And the boss also has to be honest. The boss has to kind of empower me. Let me get on with the job. Don't micromanage me. Know what he's doing. Now, if you look at the difference between those two categories, the first category, there's sort of the kind one, the best word that works for that category is care. What the person is saying is that, I work for a boss who has a genuine interest in me, who cares about me. It's the one theme. The second theme, if you work for a boss who's always honest, that person's not always going to be nice. That person's sometimes going to say things to you that you'll find upsetting.
Exactly.
The question is, so why on earth do you want that? Do you like to be upset? And clearly not. So why would somebody want the behavior? Well, how else are you going to learn? How else are you going to grow? So the benefit to you of the harder theme is that you grow, which is why people also want a boss who's fair. They want a boss who empowers them, who doesn't micromanage them, who knows what he's doing so he can teach you. So there's these two themes. If people work for a boss because they want to, it is because the boss cares for them and grows them. I discovered this on gold mines in South Africa in the 80s. That lesson has remained consistent throughout the world. Tafhim, I've asked people this question in Japan. Academics in Japan, who's the boss you'll follow because you want to? And they'll say the boss who cares for you and grows me. I've asked this of bankers in Jersey, in the UK. Same thing, of people running an NGO in America. It doesn't matter who you talk to. Everybody, if you ask somebody to describe their ideal boss, they'll say two things. The boss who cares for me sincerely and gives me an opportunity to grow. Now,
Shaykh Ebrahim.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Well, I just want to say it's intriguing that don't you think it's fascinating that these criteria should be so universal?
Yeah. But I was going to say, when you were describing this, the situation as it normally is in workplaces and your caring growth model, I think your model makes complete sense. But in real life, from all the organizations that you've met in different places, different locations, have you naturally seen many organizations who already work a bit like what you're describing? Or is there, because that whole leadership of getting the task done by the team, the concentration on the task and getting the job done, that's, in my opinion, and I have more limited kind of knowledge and experience in these things, but from what I see, kind of teams are just there to get the job done. But in your experience, have you seen those kind of organizations in place already? And do you think they can be found more sporadically in certain areas, or is it like a geographical thing, developed countries or underdeveloped countries where you see them?
So we have a prevailing view of enterprise, which kind of affects how people get taught at business schools, how people understand what running a business is about, and how people basically get weaned into leadership roles in enterprises. However, it's problematic to speak, when you speak these criteria, to speak of organizations, because it's a similar variable that you're talking about when you're talking about the issue of the success of the organization based on the degree to which the individual is there to give. Because this is about the individual. So despite the fact that there might be, the propaganda of the organization might be, we just use people as resources to get a job done. You will find successful leaders, the more successful leaders, actually work contrary to that thinking. And you'll find that throughout any organization. And the more successful organizations are, the more this view of how to deal with people becomes prevalent rather than an undertone. So in the modern world, to say that you have organizations that are caring growth organizations, I just think that's naive. I don't think that's not going to happen. But you have individuals who are caring growth individuals, because what is required of you to give. So the whole organization succeeds when everybody's there to give. But if you're in a command position, if you have a hierarchical role what do you have to give? And actually what you have to give is the care and growth of the people reporting to you. Your people are your product. It's like the coach doesn't produce a result. The coach enables players. Now, if the leadership of the enterprise would take on that psychology, what they would say is that this enterprise that we're running is like a gymnasium. And what this gymnasium enables to cultivate is extraordinary people. Now, it's very rare for that to be the average view and certainly the most senior view in an enterprise. However, I can tell you right now that in just about every enterprise there is today, there's a minority of people in leadership positions who actually have that understanding of their role. They seem to be a bit odd. They themselves don't understand why what they do works. But when we speak to them, they suddenly, it's like aha, that's why what I do works.
Yeah.
And also we have a way of framing this that actually makes it possible for more people to see the key thing that's required.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. Have you worked with like government departments? Because in the UK, I worked for as a civil servant for like over 10 years. And what I found there is almost opposite to what you're describing should be a good environment. So a lot of leaders were actually scared to develop their teams too much because then they thought their own job is going to be at risk, and constantly they're getting credit for their team's work and kind of taking credit for the work that other people do. And that whole environment was just so unnatural. And I felt it's because there's not that risk and reward situation that businesses normally have. There's no risk of going bankrupt if you're in the civil service. So they get away with a lot of things that in a normal kind of a business environment, companies just couldn't tolerate, kind of tolerating failures and not having accountability and all of those things. And we can talk about that later in this episode, accountability. But in terms of the leadership, I just felt in civil service, is that just my experience, or have you felt that in different countries in the world? Have you worked with government organizations?
We've not worked much with government. In South Africa, the few instances where we have worked with the government or state or with the civil service, I mean, the problem is that the civil service has gone unspeakably corrupt in South Africa. So there's always a double speak going on. People are so politically astute that it's really you're in you're cloud cuckoo land. I mean, it's just a hall of mirrors. You don't really get to see anybody's real colors. So we've not had much success at all working with those sorts of organizations. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk about the team structure, or I also wanted to know from you when you actually do approach businesses, when you're providing consultancy in terms of leadership, how do you measure success in that kind of a situation? Or maybe how would the business measure
those
success?
are two different questions. We'll speak, if we can park the team issue. So at the moment we're still examining hierarchy. We're looking at how leadership functions. And the
Yeah.
first question is, how do you assess? And I mean, the point we were making before is that, first of all, I feel confident assessing people against these criteria because I know the criteria are universal. I mean, if you ask anybody on the planet who's the boss they're going to work for because they want to, they'll say those two things, care and growth.
Mm.
And so it's not like you're doing an unfair assessment of somebody, because I mean, the question is, well, why should these criteria be so universal? And I mean, it becomes apparent when you look at the question that solicits the information. If you ask somebody who's the boss you're going to work for because you want to, let's assume you work for a boss because you want to, you're completely willing. The person asks you to do something and you'll immediately respond with the intent to go the extra mile. What that means is you're basically giving that person the right to ask you to do things or to exercise power over you, which means these care and growth criteria are actually the criteria for legitimate power. And when you see the problem through that lens, the universality of the criteria becomes absolutely apparent, or the reason for the universality becomes apparent. I mean, the first person who ever exercised power in your life is your parents, and in that relationship, there are two people. I mean, there's a big one and there's a little one, and the job of the big one, of the parents, is to care for and grow the child. And so, well, why should that be significant? But, we have an intuitive understanding that there's a connection between the idea of first and the idea of principle. The word first in Latin is in the word principle. I mean, it's like in many Germanic languages, like Afrikaans, which is another language I speak, the word begin, which is beginning, is in the word beginsel, which is principle. So if you want to understand the principle, look at the first manifestation. The first manifestation of power is parenting. So no surprise that therefore we, out of our intuition that came to us with our mother's milk, when we look at authority, we will apply this criteria. So if you're assessing a leader against these criteria, and this is a criteria, this is not an unfair assessment to make, because you're assessing the leader against criteria that they themselves know in their own intuition, as we would say, by their fitra. Now, in that assessment, one can. So the first thing one can. So who does the assessment? Actually, you speak to their subordinates. I mean, if you have a leadership relationship with somebody, if I want to know what kind of leader you are, I don't speak to you because you obviously have a vested interest in in the picture that we're going to get after this. I ask the people reporting to you, and we said there's these two categories: care and growth. The care categories are not very difficult to kind of fathom. I mean, does your boss listen to you? I mean, does your boss have a genuine interest in your well-being? Is your boss approachable? I mean, these are the softer things are not that difficult to get a sense of it. But what about this growth variable? And in order to understand this growth variable, you need to say, well, if you're growing somebody, what does that mean? You've heard the rule of thumb that says, don't give a man a fish, right? Sort of empower the person to fish. Now, if you wanted to empower somebody to fish, I mean, what would you give them? I mean, first of all, you'd give them stuff. You'd give them like, hook, a line, and a sinker, and some bait. And then you teach them how to use that stuff. You'd give them a course. You show, how to hook, bait a hook, and how to cast, and where to find the fish, the species you're looking at, and so on. So you basically, if you look at the difference between these two categories, give the first category is about means. It's about stuff. And the second category is about ability. It's about the skill and the competence to be able to fish. Now, the problem is if you're going to empower somebody and you're giving them those two things, that's not adequate. Because let's say you're trying to empower me, and what we've already understood about me is that I'm a lazy South African, so I don't want to do this fishing you out of your mind. It sounds like hard work. So you go through all of the hard work to sort of teach me how to fish, give me all the means I need. And because you're a nice person, you then say, well, I can see you're not that enthusiastic about this fishing. I'll tell you what, I've got a freezer full of fish. I'm a very good fisherman. If you don't catch a fish, I'll give you one from my freezer. Well, how willingly do you think I'm going to fish? And actually, I won't fish willingly at all. So what's the last thing you've got to bring to the party? And it's actually, it's kind of like a bloody mindedness. It's just say, listen, after this, if you don't catch a fish, starve. In other words, you've got to hold me accountable. So empowering me means three things. It means to give me the means to do what's required of me, make me able to do what's required of me, and to hold me accountable. So when you're assessing somebody's performance as a leader, you assess whether they care for the people working for them, whether they provide them with their means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of them. All of that is in an instrument that subordinates answer about the boss. That's the quickest and dirtiest way of sort of checking, doing an audit of the quality of the leadership in an organization. We actually call it a leadership audit.
So an organization that hasn't had that in place for a number of years or X amount of time is going to struggle with growth. But say now someone like yourself comes in and wants to make a change. If that change is implemented, a lot of that staff, because they're in that environment now where they haven't had any challenges put upon them, are they likely to lose like half of their staff, or because people generally don't like change, even ultimately if it's going to be to their benefit?
No, we've not found that. I mean, first of all, change in organizations is incremental. Right? I mean, if you think you're going to come with a switch, and one day the organization is abusive and consumes people as resources in the process of getting a job done, and the next day there'll be sort of this place that is wonderful. I mean, that change is incremental. It's not one step. Strangely enough, also, very often organizations become collusions of mediocrity. Because the whole thing is about control, it's not about holding people accountable. You see, there's a perverse kind of inverted relationship between accountability and control. If I control you, then you're not accountable for what you're doing. The more control I exercise over a person, the less autonomy they have, the less they can be held accountable for what they're doing. So paradoxically, people actually do this, and they are more malevolently disposed, and they try and get away with the minimum. So when there's the shift, the first thing that happens is that people that have sort of developed a bit of almost like a malevolent investment in a sick status quo, they find life not as easy as before. So yes, you do lose some people, but generally
I'm thinking, because when you're trying to implement these kind of positive changes, initially I thought resistance is probably going to come from leadership, because we're putting more demand on leadership to change their practices, change in work environment. But in reality, a lot of the resistance may actually come from the team themselves.
That's right.
Okay. So normally this would apply not just in different cultures, but also in different size of organizations, because I'm thinking whether the organization is small or large, or even the kind of work that they're doing. I'm thinking because some organizations are more reactionary, like emergency services and things like that, where it's hard to make plans for the whole day or the whole week or the month or year ahead, and you have to just react to such scenarios. But it's still, this model would work for those as well.
The more you have to rely on the initiative of the person who's doing the job, the more these criteria should be followed. Now, for instance, if you're looking at like anybody who, say a fire service, I mean, once you're there, if the person is actually, got the axe and the hose, doesn't make the fighting of the fire their own personal problem, and they aren't given the authority and the initiative to actually do something about what's in front of them, then that person is not going to fight the fire very well. So in fact, it's almost paradoxical. The more we think of enterprises as being sort of almost militaristic command and control, and the less you need the autonomy of the individual, it's actually the opposite. The more you need the autonomy of the individual. In a gold mine, you've got a guy who's working in a panel that is maybe 7 or 8 kilometers away from the closest shaft. He would see a senior leader in his panel, if he's lucky, maybe once a month. What he and his supervisor gets up to in that panel can do anything from producing huge amounts of metal to putting blood on the rock. If you don't create the conditions where the people in the panel have the autonomy to actually do what's required of them and do it well, then basically you have a sub-optimized system.
Because I'm thinking of some organizations that I know of in Pakistan, very successful organizations doing very well, have a lot of growth and development, but the leadership are having to micromanage everything, can't take their eye off the ball for a second because everything's going to collapse, because they feel that it's a different culture. They tell me it's fine in the UK, you have rights and you have like responsibilities and all of these things, but in Pakistan things work very differently. And unless you're standing over everyone's heads shouting and screaming at them all day long, things just don't work. And I'm just mentioning Pakistan to you because I know that you do consultancy in Pakistan as well, so you are kind of familiar with that environment. What do you say? Is micromanaging like a sign of a environment that needs some improvement?
Look, I mean, you'd be familiar with servants in Pakistan. And you get one servant, one family whose servants have been with them since Pa fell off the bus, and those servants completely run the household. They go to the stores, they get the food, they prepare the food, they keep the house clean. In fact, it is like the people living in that house are living in a hotel. And you get another household where they're screaming and shouting every second day. Servants are kind of fired, hand over fist. In fact, they've probably got double the number of servants in any other household. People don't do what's required of them. They keep on deliberately breaking the crockery. And now, what's the difference between the two households? And it's basically how the servants get treated. In the one, there's a genuine interest in them, and they have been empowered to run the household. The other one, they get micromanaged and treated like idiots and screamed at the whole day. Well, so that's this, and I'm pretty certain that in a manufacturing concern in Pakistan, you will have some supervisors who've got really excellent relationships with their teams. Not all supervisors are the same. Yeah. And you get other supervisors who are a nightmare to work with, have the constant turnover of people, and probably need double the number of people to get the same job done. Because the people working for them are just downright resistant. To say every single Pakistani working person is resistant is just false, because we know we have this example of domestic servants. How completely different they can be.
Yeah, as you described that, I could picture certain households where things are working so smoothly that the owner of the household doesn't even have to take anything into account on a daily or weekly basis, and everything just works like clockwise. And there's the other kind of scenario as well, where constantly they're having to scream and shout and make sure everything's working okay, and it still isn't. But so in addition to the relationship between teams and leadership, what about like the relationship between members of teams themselves? Because how do we manage that relationship where people don't feel that they have to step on each other's heads to progress.
If you think about a successful soccer team, for instance, a football team, surely if the team is successful, it's because most of the work that happens on the field is not about somebody scoring. Most of the work is concerned with somebody trying to set somebody else up to score. Now, if you just consider that from the point of view of the intent of the player who's trying to set their colleague up to score, is what they're actually saying to their colleague is, I'm quite happy for you to be the star. I don't have to be the star. So when you have this thing in a team where people are deliberately trying to set each other up to succeed, that magnanimity, that's when you have a team. When everybody in the team is trying to be the star themselves, you don't have a team. You've basically got a herd of cats. Now, good leaders develop teams where people deliberately try and collaborate, deliberately try and set each other up to succeed and actually celebrate each other's success and aren't just competing with each other. Bad leaders will use the competition between that happens naturally among a team of people and not try and govern it, but would actually try and exploit it to try and squeeze a little bit extra effort out of each person. And then they get people who will who quite cheerfully and deliberately do things that are damaging to the enterprise as long as I get one step over the guy as my colleague. So you can say, well, what's the key sort of deliverable of the leader? If we say the leader, I'm here for my people. I'm here to care for them and grow them. I'm not here to get something out of them. What is the thing that I'm here to cultivate, actually? It's this spirit which is translated into I'm there to set my colleague up to succeed. If you have that spirit, you have a team. If you don't have that spirit, you have illness. And it's perfectly possible to have that in any kind of team. In an agricultural team, in a manufacturing team, in a mining team, in a services team. It's quite possible to have that. But it means that people have an experience of being significant, which is good enough that they don't have to still go and stand on somebody else's head to become more significant. There's a fundamental affirmation. There's not a fundamental negation of people.
I think the sports analogies that you provided in 2 or 3 different occasions, I think they're very apt because ultimately, I think sometimes when I was trying to think about leadership and how to control my team and do these things, it feels daunting. But when you start thinking of yourself as a coach rather than just as a manager or a leader, then things start making more sense. However, having said that, talking about teams, I'm just thinking of Pakistan's cricket team because I'm into cricket, and
Right.
anyone who supports Pakistan cricket team knows what a big nightmare it is because everyone wants to be the star of the team, which means that we sometimes we do really well and sometimes we just collapse in a big disaster. And again, that doesn't have to be the case because of the nature of the players. That probably represents the coaching style. Because I remember in the past we had a coach called Bob Woolmer from the UK that went over, and the team completely changed. Everyone was like, the team had never been so united. Just when they had a different coaching model. So, just in that, I can see like the bad side of Pakistan and the good side of Pakistan, and the reason why that's happening.
Tafhim, what enterprises are like villages. They're actually communities. Now, think about this. What village do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a village where everybody's trying to get one over their neighbor and is trying to get as much as they can out of the sort of the common good for putting in as little as possible? Is that the kind of village you want to live in? Or do you want to live in a village where your neighbor actually has your back? Your neighbor will be there to help you, and that you're all working together to make a better life for everybody in the village. I mean, surely you want to live in the latter kind of a world. So this is not silly kumbaya stuff. I mean, makes absolute sense. And it also has to make sense that if this village was an enterprise, the happy village will probably be a more successful enterprise than the unhappy village. You know, I mean, apart from anything else, the citizens won't be stealing so much from each other in the happy village.
Yeah. Shaykh Ebrahim, you've been providing consultancy in all over the world. At the moment, are you engaged in a number of different countries, or where are you focused mostly?
Look, I've taken quite a back seat. I'm not that heavily involved in the consultancy anymore. But I still do a little bit of work in Europe, and I've now started doing work for a client that has a multinational that has operations in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and in South Africa. So I've got that's sort of at the moment my footprint. The couple of years running up to this, I was mainly in South Africa, mainly in the mining industry, in the platinum mining industry.
Without giving any names away, are you able to provide any real life examples of um, things improving, whether that was through your company or you just observing other companies to see how um, they've evolved over time, the culture and the growth in that company? I'm just thinking in the UK, I'm just thinking of places like Lush. I don't know if you've heard of that. There's another place called, I think it's called Timothy, where the owners of the business actually hire people who have come out of prison because they want to give them an opportunity to improve themselves and to learn a skill and to reintegrate into society. And it's an amazing business model, very successful.
Hmm. I mean, the first thing one needs to be very wary of in our game is that you don't lay claim to your client's success. I mean, it's their success. We've also worked with clients who seemed to try what we were trying to do, and the whole thing failed. So, so I'd like to put that caveat down before I actually describe an enterprise. Sure. And also, these things are particularly in corporates. The windows are very small; they're short because it's absolutely associated with the senior team and the senior team's view of their role. And if that senior team changes, as happens in corporate life, people either retire or they move on to other jobs, or very quickly you can have a very healthy situation go very, very sour. So having taken out all of those kind of insurances, I've recently worked with a platinum mine that when we started working with, so it's really all of the success that I'm about to describe is actually the product of the man who ran the operation, who was the CEO of the operation. His name is Mark Monroe. And when we started working, he got us in because I worked with him before elsewhere. When he started on the mine, it was they had a terrible safety record. I mean, they killed 18 people in the year prior to him starting on the operation. It's a big operation, over 40,000 people, 35,000 people. They were basically right at the bottom of the platinum mining industry. So, platinum is that kind of metal that when there's too many providers in the market, the price dips to the point where one of the providers get kind of thrown out. And Impala Platinum was right at the bottom of that. It was one of the biggest producers, and also at the same time one of the most expensive and one of the least viable. And he basically turned it around within 5 years to being one of the safest, of the best reserves, profitable. Literally, it was quite an incredible turnaround over a 5-year period. by deliberately working on the culture. The culture was the principal handle that he kind of worked with, the sort of lever to affect a change.
Can you also think of any businesses where it's actually, I'm just thinking of like generational changes as well. So is there different expectations from millennials, Generation Z, X, Y, Z, whatever they are, in terms of the demands that the business places on them and what they can expect to get back? It just seems like the younger generation just are living in a completely different world to what we lived in the past. So, do you see any like challenges as a result of that?
I do think it's true that younger people come into the workplace with far more expectations than what generations before did. But I also think that younger people always come into the world with more expectations. I mean, that by the time these people hit their 30s, they're kind of tamed.
I'm sorry, I missed that last bit. What did you say?
By the time people hit their 30s, they're sort of tamed. I mean, they're
Yeah,
kind of like, this is as much a problem of youth, which is a universal problem of youth. Every society struggles with young people who have a sense that they are owed more than what the society seems to want to give them. But at the same time, I think that, I mean, it does sound, I don't know, because I'm not running a business anymore. It does sound like this is becoming particularly bad. I mean, if I just, one of our client organizations is Saab, and people there were saying that, in the first 20, the person's 25 years old, and they really want to know, why aren't they a manager yet? They've just called out of college and they got a single qualification, and they start off wanting a guarantee of advancement. No idea that you have to earn that advancement. It's kind of no. This is so.
yeah.
There does seem to be a problem like that. But then again, there's if you work for a supervisor who is genuinely there for you the first thing that supervisor would do is kind of put you in a cold shower, disabuse you of this peculiar illusion that you have any rights in this business. You actually do need to earn your keep.
Yeah.
The problem is that those confrontational conversations don't happen because they're considered to be sort of politically incorrect. And as long as I can keep this person modified enough to get a result out of them, then that's fine. My job isn't to fix this person. My job is to produce something. But as soon as I understand my job is actually to help this person become a better human being, then that's no longer tolerable. And then, the right conversations happen and people do change their mind.
Yeah. So we've talked about the individuals having an ability, and maybe they might need training or care and growth, and then they need to have the means to carry out their job. And then the third thing that you talked about was accountability. How is accountability enforced? Is it like a constant kind of a threat of getting a sack, or is it like a weekly, monthly? How do we do accountability?
Well, the first thing is that you can't hold somebody accountable if you're just going to look at their results.
Okay.
The second thing is accountability. It's an unfortunate word because it seems punitive. But accountability surely has to mean both rewards and punishments. If you're accountable, it means that if you've got it right, then you get appropriately rewarded. So it is running through the middle of the issue of accountability is the issue of standards, and your performance can either be above standard or below standard. And if they're above standard or below standard for reasons other than means, and if they're below standard for reasons other than means and ability, It means you, at some level, you're either careless or you're deliberate. That's when disciplinary action is necessary. So it's not like people are living under the cosh all the time. Because so just as a decision tree, the first thing I ask myself is what you did to standard or not? And if you did do to standard, I either recognize you, or if you really shot out the lights, I reward you. If what you've done is not to standard, then the next question I ask myself, well, is this a means issue? And if it's a means issue, I go no further. I have to fix that because it's a means problem. If, however, it's not a means issue, I then ask myself, is this an ability issue? And if it's an ability issue, I fix that. I go no further. If, however, your performance is not on standard, and it's not a means issue, and it's not an ability issue, then I have to assume that this is an accountability issue. Now, there's only two variables left after this. The first thing I need to ask myself is what you're doing deliberate, or is it just careless? Because if what you're doing is deliberate, then you should get the sack right there. You know, if you're being deliberately smashing a machine, cheating on a timesheet, then you should be dismissed. If you're careless, however, you just don't give a damn, that's when I would go on a process of sort of incremental discipline, start off with a verbal warning, and then all the way up to a final written warning, and then dismissal. So there's a definite decision tree. It's not like people are living under terror the whole time. If you're doing the job right, then you'll be affirmed. If you're struggling because you don't know how to do the job, then you'll be helped. And if I hold you accountable for either a means issue or an ability issue, I'm actually committing a mistake that we call the hard mistake. That's when you're being too tough with people. But these days that happens very rarely, And people are so terrified of, we have an employer's kind of court, a labor court in South Africa called the CCMA that protects people. So it's very unlikely that somebody would get dismissed for a means issue or an ability issue. Management just doesn't get away with that.
Also, Shaykh Ebrahim, so we talked about like cultural influence. I can see that this model would work in whatever the culture is, and even whatever the education level is, all of those things. But surely the culture would impact how likely it is for an organization to actually implement this. Is that something you see? Like, are different businesses in different cultures, different communities, whether it's developing countries or whether it's the difference between Europe and USA, for example, are they more or less likely to implement it? And does that mean that there's like a systemic kind of behavior that's ingrained in society?
Look, I think that it is. I mean, certain cultures. So if we say the critical variable of the difference between sick and healthy cultures, organizational cultures, is the intent of the individual to make a contribution. There's certain kind of cultures that are just better at producing people like that than others. And I can give you a number of examples. The Swedes is a case in point. I mean, just off the top of your head, can you name any really famous Swedish brands?
There was the mobile phone company. What's it called? Ericsson.
Ericsson, IKEA.
The car company they had.
Saab, Volvo,
Yes.
and by the way, Saab don't just produce cars. I mean, they stopped producing cars. They produce fighter aircraft. They produce, all sorts of things. Alfa Laval in mining, in agriculture, Sandvik in mining. I mean, there's a raft of really successful enterprises. There's only 10 million people in the country. There's half the number of people in the country as what there are in Karachi. This tiny population of people have made this unbelievable contribution to the human condition. Why? Because they, what Swedes know anything is collaboration. The Swedes know I'm there to make my colleagues succeed. They actually do sports like that. sort of behavior that you would get away with in a South African enterprise. Make sure you've put the guy in his place. You've got one over him. You kind of you get your point across. Nail this issue home. You win the argument. That behavior, and so they won't speak to you at this water cooler afterwards. They don't even know how to deal with people like that. So the Japanese is another case in point where there's just people that have kind of seem to have been brought up with this understanding that I'm here to make a contribution. Whereas other cultures, like, dare I say, South African, where people are fundamentally suspicious of the man. They're fundamentally suspicious of the establishment, and they actually are deeply convinced that the establishment's just there to screw them over, and their job is to get as much as they can for giving as little as possible. And I dare say Pakistan is similar to that too.
Yeah.
But even in that context, if you're working at enterprise level, you can affect that consciousness.
Shaykh Ebrahim, thank you so much. It's been really interesting talking to you about this. Before we go, if you have any websites or links, please do share with me, and I can add them to the notes, and I'm sure people would love to see and follow.
I'll be very happy. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Delight speaking to you. Thank you, sir. All the best.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.